To the philosophy department, I would like to extend a special thank you for all the volunteers in Compassionate Action for Animals who have made this.
I'm Jeffrey Hellman. I'm the chair of the philosophy department, one of the long list of sponsors of this event. And I want to welcome you to this special colloquium. I want first to thank Ramona Alea and other graduate students in the Department of Philosophy, as well as members and students in the CAA, for their initiatives in helping bring about this event. Students in our department have played a vital role over several years in organizing colloquia on topics of widespread interest and from a very wide range of perspectives. And I'm very optimistic that that will continue in the years ahead. Well, I've been offered this opportunity to say something about philosophy in our department in just about 3 minutes. If anyone doubts that a lot can happen in 3 minutes, I recommend reading Nobel physicist Steven Weinberg's wonderful little non-technical book on the Big Bang, entitled The First 3 Minutes. But really, in the present late state of the universe, what can you possibly say about philosophy in a soundbite? The best I could come up with is this: philosophy cannot be done by soundbite. Well, having bitten that bullet, I would highlight 3 major aspects of philosophy as a discipline. First, its fundamental character, asking hard questions about how we can justify our claims to knowledge about the world around us, about ourselves and our relationship to the world, and how we can justify our claims about values, about what ought to be. Second, its concern with method, its respect for rigor in the use of logic and evidence, including ongoing inquiry into the very standards of logic and evidence as they bear on particular topics of interest from the sciences and everyday life. And third, its dialectical approach of patient examination of a wide diversity of viewpoints, considered in long-term dialogue with one another through reasoned argument. Our department is an enabler of philosophy in all these aspects, promoting research, learning, reflection, exploration, and discussion of the broadest range of topics and points of view. As such an enabler, of course, we do not take, quote, official stands on substantive philosophical questions. Can you imagine our saying, "We regard Descartes' third meditation to be in error in its French twist on the argument from design"? Or, "It is our official position that Bertrand Russell's critique of Hegel is fundamentally correct," and so forth. Much less do we express or imply agreement with guest lecturers simply by having them share the results of their inquiries with us. And finally, we recognize that diverse, in-depth explorations of complex issues, especially those affecting multiple interests, typically require multiple events and discussions spanning years, not days, and certainly not minutes. Once again, not by soundbite. But now I'm sure that my 3 minutes are up, and so thank you for your attention. And let me turn this over now to my colleague, Valerie Tiberius, who will finally introduce our speaker.
Don't worry, I'm the last warm-up band. You're almost there. First, a few more thank yous. On behalf of the organizers of tonight's program, I want to start by saying thank you to CENSHARE, that's the Center to Study Human-Animal Relationship and Environments, CLA Scholarly Event Fund, Compassionate Action for Animals, GAPSA Academic Initiative, the Graduate Student Philosophy Association, the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science, the Philosophy Department, the Program in Agriculture, Food, and Environmental Ethics, and the Students for Social Responsibility. The organizers are grateful for a Minnesota Student Association DEF grant and a Student Activities Office Event Partnership grant. And finally, special thanks are due to the University of Minnesota McKnight Arts and Humanities Endowment. So thank you to all of the sponsors. After thanking the sponsors, I think it's right to point out that, as he always does, PeterSinger is donating his fee for the evening, this time to Vegan Outreach. And you can see what that's all about. You can see what that's all about at veganoutreach.org. So people often say that PeterSinger is one of the most influential living philosophers. In fact, I think it says that on the poster for tonight's event. Well, I thought I would invest this claim by applying a rigorous scientific methodology, otherwise known as Googling. So I Googled as many philosophers as I could, as many famous philosophers as I could think of, and I discovered that there are more entries for PeterSinger than for any other philosopher, living or dead. If you Google most famous philosopher, you get Richard Rorty. And Richard Rorty gets 1 million hits. PeterSinger gets 39 million hits. The closest I could find to this record is Plato. Some of you might have heard of him, with 37 million. The eminently Googleable Professor Singer is currently Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University, and also Laureate Professor at the University of Melbourne's Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics. He's written or edited, by my count, 40 different books. Perhaps his most famous and most widely read book is Animal Liberation, which has been translated into 18 different languages. Most recently, he's the author, together with Jim Mason, of The Way We Eat, Why Our Food Choices Matter, which is scheduled to be published by Rodale Press in May of this year. He's also recently edited In Defense of Animals, The Second Wave, published by Oxford University Press in 2005. He's written a vast number of articles that have been published in places ranging from the very best journals in professional philosophy to the New York Times to Slate magazine. He's written on many topics in practical ethics, including environmental ethics, famine relief, and animal welfare. But Singer's importance to moral philosophy has a lot more to do with what he says than with how much he says. Singer's arguments are deceptively simple. They begin with compelling and powerful moral premises about the badness of suffering, and they lead us to conclusions that cause drastic revisions of our everyday lives. After reading Singer, we cannot feel the same way about spending money on luxuries for ourselves when there are millions of children throughout the world suffering from hunger and malnutrition. Singer's work on animal welfare in particular has had profound effects on the animal rights movement. In fact, Newsweek magazine has stated that the modern animal rights movement began with the publication of Singer's Animal Liberation. His work on animal welfare has also had profound effects on individuals. I'm just one of the many people who report having read Singer's book and stopped eating meat. I regularly teach Singer's Animal Liberation in my ethics classes, and I regularly have students who come back, sometimes years later, and tell me that they have become vegetarian because they read PeterSinger's work in my class. There is no other philosopher whose work has caused my students to change their lives and return to tell me about it. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what he has to tell us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Professor PeterSinger.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. Thank you, Valerie, for that very warm introduction, which should put you on guard about whether you can rely on Google about anything. And thank you also everyone who's been involved in organising this. I'd like to reiterate my thanks to the volunteers of Compassionate Action for Animals, who I know worked very hard to make this event possible. And I'm delighted that it's come about, and I'm delighted their efforts have been rewarded, at least so far as gathering a great audience. The rest, I suppose, is up to me. So, I'm really happy to be talking to you about this topic, about ethics and animals. Obviously, it's something that I've been interested in, been working on for more than 30 years now, about 35 years, in fact, since I first became aware of the issues that I'm going to be talking to you about. And I guess for me, at the time in 1970, 1971, I was a graduate student at the University of Oxford. And it was something of a shock to realise that all of my life, at least up to that point, I had been unaware of what I then started to see was really one of the major moral issues of our times, and indeed of all times. In a way, it's like learning that some sort of moral atrocity has been going on all the time, and you've been taking part in it without actually thinking about it, without being aware of it. You've been part of that sort of silent ascent that we know about from history in various other occasions, where later generations look back and say, how could people have actually done that? How could apparently decent people, the founders of this nation, have been slave owners, for example? And I felt that I was in something of that sort of situation. And to some extent, I still think we are in that situation. But I am pleased to say that although there has not been over that 30 or 35 years quite the progress that I would have liked to see, there is certainly much greater awareness of these issues. And just in the last few years, I think we've started to see some real signs of more concrete progress. Not particularly in this country, I have to sadly say. I think where I would look for more awareness and more progress on these issues would be in Europe, in the United Kingdom, in the European Union more generally. And I think this country, as I'll say in a little bit more detail, is lagging behind. But I do think that we are starting to at least face up, in some parts of the world, to face up to the enormity of these issues and to think about what we can do about it to at least make some sort of steps towards it. So what I'm going to do now is just go through some of the basic moral argument for those of you who are not familiar with it still, to lay it out in a short but I hope respectable philosophical way, and then look at some of the practical implications of the conclusions that I think ought to follow from it. So if we're talking about ethics in animals, we're interested in what are our ethical obligations in respect of animals. That's the first question. And the first thing you might want to ask, probably we don't ask it because most of us take it for granted, is, well, when we talk about animals, what do we mean? What sorts of beings are they? And so the first question we have to ask is, are animals conscious beings? So we know that we are conscious beings. We know that from our first-person experience. We can feel things, we can feel pain, we can suffer. Conversely, we can experience pleasure, and we can have a general feeling of well-being, that our lives are going reasonably well. We're satisfied. Is that true of non-human animals? If the answer were no, if they could not experience anything, then I think I could stop what I have to say right here. They would then just be things. And Descartes, who just got mentioned, and the philosophy department is not going to take an official stance on, did actually hold the view, at least professed the view, whether he could really believe it, that animals are automata, that they don't feel anything. And when it was pointed out that they make noises as if they feel anything, Descartes' reply essentially was, well, so do alarm clocks. And we design alarm clocks, but God designs animals. So, if we can design alarm clocks to make a noise, God can design animals to make much more sophisticated, wider range of noises. But not very many people really believed Descartes, I think, in that, and certainly really just about nobody today does. I think that is one thing that you could probably find unanimity in the philosophy department, whether or not they want to make an official pronouncement on it. And certainly you can find, it's very hard to find scientists now who will maintain the view that animals don't have experiences. Maybe 20 or 30 years ago, when behaviorism was more fashionable, you did find psychologists who refused to positively assert that animals do have experiences and who described animals as if they were just observing behaviour. But that was because they thought it was more scientific to just describe what you can really directly observe and not impute mental states that you don't directly observe. But in fact, that's gone completely out of fashion, and scientists now are much more comfortable at imputing mental states to animals. And in fact, if we want to describe animals, it works much better if we describe them as being sad or angry or fearful or whatever it might be, rather than trying to describe the behaviour that leads us to conclude that. It's a better way of communicating to people what is going on with an animal. But how do we know, really? How can we be confident that animals do feel? Well, this is the three major lines of argument, I'd suggest, that lead us to be able to have that kind of confidence. We can examine the anatomy and physiology of animals, and we know that it works fairly similarly with us. I'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment about which animals I'm talking about here. But we can look at how similar the anatomy is. We can look at the nervous system, the way in which impulses are relayed along the nervous system to a brain, and what that brain is like, and so on. We can see the biochemical correlates of that, and so on. We can look at the behaviour. This is something we all see, of course. We see an animal in a situation that would hurt us if we were in that situation. The animal has been scalded with boiling water, or hit with a heavy object or a sharp object or something like that. We see that the behaviour is pretty similar to the way that we would behave under those circumstances. And furthermore, while someone might say, well, maybe Descartes couldn't do it, but we do construct even very clever robots that mimic some of this behaviour. Yes, we can, but we know that in fact non-human animals are not constructed to mimic our pain behaviour. We know that they have evolved, or that we have evolved from our common ancestors with them, and indeed therefore that we have common origins, and it seems reasonable to assume, in the light of these common origins, that the anatomy and physiology we're observing works in a broadly similar way, and that the behaviour is also similarly related to that. Now, as I said, that may not be true of all animals, and whenever I give a lecture of this sort, if I don't in some way forestall the question, somebody is going to say, well, what about mosquitoes or something like that? Do you want to extend your ethical views in the treatment of animals to mosquitoes or cockroaches or something? So you do have to ask this question clearly. And what I've just been saying applies, I think, most directly to mammals and birds. Pretty directly, I think you can say, to all vertebrates. But you'll get a little bit more argument from some people when you move beyond mammals and birds. Specifically, there's been some debate in the journals about whether the neocortex of fish is, that's less developed, and is it, since that's associated with pain perception in humans, is it possible that they don't feel pain despite showing similar behaviour when they would be in pain when they're out of the water or something of that sort? So I'd be prepared to acknowledge that there's a little bit of doubt entering into that. That is, we can't be as confident about pain in fish as we can in birds and mammals. But I think we can still be fairly confident of it, because the pain behaviour is similar, and we don't really know enough about the brain to know, or to exclude the idea that capacities for experiencing pain can exist in other parts of the brain, and that would explain the behaviour that we're seeing. When we get down to invertebrates, we know a lot less about how things function, and we have much bigger differences, much bigger gap in evolutionary history, of course, much bigger differences between us and them. So it's harder to be clear about whether invertebrates really are conscious and really feel. Although some of them, that's why I single out the octopus here, are so good at learning, and so amazing at learning tasks, including novel tasks like screwing off the lid of a jar of peanut butter so that you can get at the yummy stuff inside. But it's hard to imagine that they're not consciously doing this. It doesn't seem to be just a sort of random hit or miss, trial and error sort of thing. So it does seem that however they do it, some invertebrates are conscious. Crustacea, again, I think you can say there's difficult to be certain. Again, the behaviour looks like it, but the organisation of the nervous system is very different. It's actually diffuse. It's not simply in a central brain. Makes it harder to know what's going on. Insects, it seems somewhat more plausible to explain their behaviour as being non-conscious because it is more rigid, although we've learned that bees can do amazing things in the way of communicating the source of nectar, of pollens to other bees when they return to the hive, or communicate where's a good location for a new hive. So there's just a lot that we don't understand here. And perhaps a certain amount of agnosticism is appropriate as to whether insects are conscious or not. With organisms like clams and oysters, I think it gets less likely. I wouldn't say you could exclude the possibility of consciousness, but it wouldn't serve the sort of function that it serves in more mobile organisms, which can sense pain and move away from it and so on. And the nervous system is very rudimentary, at least in bivalves like clams and oysters and so on. So maybe you'd have to say the probability is that they don't have experiences. But what I'm saying is, and this is sort of to forestall the mosquito question, there's a gradation here. There's a gradation of certainty with, I think, very high levels of confidence at the top, rather low levels of confidence at the bottom. And perhaps what that means is we can behave in appropriate ways, given uncertainty and given the degree of uncertainty, and given also our needs, perhaps, to do something which, if there is pain, is going to cause pain or distress or harm to the creatures we're doing it to. Of course, I'm jumping ahead here and I'm assuming we ought not to be doing that, but I'll get to that. Okay, so that's by way of preliminary. Now, what are we going to think about the ethics of how we ought to relate to these other beings who can, or probably can, suffer? What I've put up here is the traditional view, as I call it, but in fact what you could say is it's been the dominant view in the Western tradition for most of the last 2,500 or whatever it is, we go back to Aristotle a little bit less years. So we're going here from some centuries BC with Aristotle, 300 or 400 years BC. We're going through the medieval period up to the 18th century. And this is really the dominant view through all of that period. It's only really, there's only a couple of exceptions that you can find in the Christian tradition, anyway, to this view, which essentially is saying that animals don't matter for their own sake. They're saying, insofar as there's a reason not to be cruel to animals, not to cause pain to animals, it's for humans. So you get the Aristotelian view that these lower things exist for the sake of the higher things. That's their purpose in existence. And you don't find a discussion in Aristotle really of the ethics of how we ought to treat them beyond the fact that we're entitled to use them. Then you find Aquinas combining that view, taking the Aristotelian view, combining it with Christian views, particularly with things that he finds attributed to St. Paul in Paul's letter to the Romans, the sort of rhetorical question, doth God care for oxen, which seems to imply to Aquinas that Paul thinks God doth not care for oxen. Similar remarks from Augustine. So Aquinas actually says flatly that it really just doesn't matter how you behave to animals. God has put them in our power. We don't have any obligations to them. We don't even have duties of charity to them. The only reason that there is why people might not be cruel to animals is because if they are cruel to animals, they may harden their disposition and become cruel to humans. So that implies that the animals don't count at all. And that essentially is what Kant was saying at the end of the 18th century. So as I say, that I think is the traditional and the dominant view in the West. There are, of course, some different things you can find in the Hebrew scriptures. You can find some remarks that suggest some degree of kindness or compassion for animals. You can find, you know, in the stories told about Pythagoras, actually in Greek times maybe, but you can't find very much. And then once you get to the Christian era, you get this real desert of, I think, of compassionate feeling to animals, until you get to at least the Renaissance, to Montesquieu, which has some remarks, and David Hume then, and then you start to get a lot more later in the 18th and 19th centuries. But the reason I stress this is, it's important to recognise that we are part of this tradition, that this is the tradition in which our institutions were forged and our practices were forged. And if you don't agree with this, and I hope that, you know, even without any argument from me, people won't agree with this because this is not the dominant current view. But if you don't agree with this, then we at least ought to think carefully about, have we nevertheless inherited practices which developed under this view, which once we change this view even somewhat moderately, we might want to reconsider. Okay, so let's look at what we might call the mainstream view today, which is an improvement on that traditional view. Essentially, it says we ought to be kind to animals. We have some duties to be kind to animals. And, you know, we have societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, which try and encourage people to be kind to animals, or even have some punitive powers to those who are clearly cruel to animals. So wanton cruelty is bad, and we will prohibit wanton cruelty, and in extreme cases we will punish it with the force of the law. But when we're doing things like satisfying our interests, I here use the example of producing meat or eggs cheaply, then we can sacrifice animal interests in order to do so. That's not seen as a problem on this mainstream view. And I put up this query here, which I'm just going to relate to what I'm going to be talking about in a moment, which I think is a kind of a puzzle to think about if you say, yeah, well, that mainstream view seems pretty well right to me. So part of the mainstream view is accepted in this society is that we don't support blood sports. We think that cockfighting and bullfighting and so on are ruled out by this view. So what are we to say to the person who says, look, I really enjoy watching two cocks fight. That's my, you know, one of my important recreational activities. Why can't I satisfy that, right? Given that you think that it's okay for you to satisfy your interest in eating beef or chicken. So I'll just leave that with you and come back to it. Okay, briefly, this is a view of ethics that is around that I should at least mention. Some philosophers think that morality is a social contract between beings capable of reciprocity, so beings who have a sense of justice. Clearly I've got John Rawls, among others, in mind here, and Rawls essentially says something like this in his first and I think most important work, The Theory of Justice. He does actually say that at least justice is not owed to animals because they lack a sense of reciprocity. He doesn't exclude that there are some other moral principles that might apply to it. This view, I think, if it excludes beings who have a sense of reciprocity, it would suggest that we also have no moral obligations to those with permanent intellectual disabilities, which I think is a problem for that view. If you consign that category of human beings to the same moral category as animals, it would seem to suggest we can treat them as we now treat animals, which most of us, I think, rightly would recoil from in horror. It also excludes future generations because, you know, we can't have reciprocal relations with future generations. What's posterity ever done for me? So contract views have a real problem, I think, in explaining why, for example, a simple solution to problems of disposing of nuclear waste, if we build a lot of nuclear power stations, isn't just to wrap them up in containers that will last 150 years and throw them in the lake, because none of us are going to be here in 150 years. So I think this is an inadequate view of morality, not only in regard to animals, but more broadly. Okay, this is the view that I'm going to defend in respect of animals. It's a form of equality, and this is why I entitled the first chapter of Animal Liberation, All Animals Are Equal, which of course was a bit of a reference to George Orwell and Animal Farm, but I did have a serious point to it. But it's also a point which can be a little misleading, and so I want to just take a moment or two to explain what I mean by it. When I first got interested in this issue, as I said, when I was a graduate student at Oxford, I hadn't really thought very much about questions about animals. One of the issues that I was thinking about and was interested in was the question of equality, human equality. And for those of you who are not philosophers, haven't looked at this, the problem that philosophers have been discussing for some time about human equality is roughly this. Where most of us, at least in liberal, democratic, developed societies, are prepared to say all humans are equal. That's a statement that in some way we give our assent to. But what exactly is it that we mean by that? Because when we look at humans, we realise that actually they vary, and on almost any scale that you might wish to assess them along, they will vary. So if you want to see how tall they are, obviously they vary how much they weigh. You want to see how fast they can run 100 metres, or how fast they can run 10,000 metres, they will vary. If we want to see how well they can solve a set of math problems, they will vary. If we want to see how many grammatical mistakes they write in writing an essay, they will vary. If we want to ask how compassionate are they, how far will they go out of their way to help others, they will vary. So, almost anything that you can think about, humans actually are different. So what is it we mean when we say they're equal? That's the kind of problem that philosophers grapple with. And, I was thinking about that issue and trying to work out that issue, and was aware of these differences when I was confronted with this question about obligations, our obligation to animals. And incidentally, the reason I was confronted with it was that I had lunch with a fellow student who was a vegetarian. So never underestimate the power that you can have just by being a vegetarian and setting an example to others. So he got me thinking about these issues. And essentially the way in which the discussion went and the way in which I then formulated the problem myself was this. Look, we claim that all humans are equal, but it's not really in respect of any specific characteristic that humans seem to have. And when we claim that humans are equal, I'd always thought of this, and I'm sure you've always thought of this, as an important progressive claim to defend. Because when we say all humans are equal, we are turning ourselves against racism and sexism and things of that sort, which historically have led to the oppression of groups of human beings in horrible ways. But at the same time, if you say that all humans are equal, at the same time as you draw this circle around humans and say, I'm going to count them all the same, all having equal moral worth or whatever, you don't always think that thereby you cut humans off from a huge number of other sentient beings, non-human animals. And so, yes, it's positive looked at within the sphere of human beings, but it could also be seen as restrictive when looked at from outside. it could be seen as drawing this circle around ourselves, which of course is exactly what the racists who we're trying to rebut were doing. They were saying, well, you know, if you're white or Caucasian or whatever it might be, then you're special. But if you're African, then we can go and enslave you, as was said in the 18th century. So we're trying to get away from that, but in a way, aren't we doing something a bit similar? Aren't we drawing the sphere around ourselves? And so it was that started to make me wonder whether this was actually right. And then, you know, I was thinking, well, but, you know, perhaps there's some characteristic that all humans have that gives them this special moral status that no non-human animals have. But if you start thinking about that, I think it doesn't take too long to realise that there's not likely to be any such characteristic, or at least no such characteristic that you can really find a firm foundation for. If you look at what the great philosophers say, you know, Kant, for example, who I put up there before, well, they may say things like, you know, all humans have inherent moral worth or intrinsic dignity, but what is that supposed to mean? Why should it be that just being born a member of the species Homo sapien gives you some kind of intrinsic dignity or moral worth that if you're born a member of a different species, you don't have? That's a bit mysterious, isn't it? Why just biological membership of a species should give you that status or dignity? And we don't really think that you have to be a member of the species Homo sapien. You have to have that particular genetic composition to have dignity. I mean, we have all sorts of science fiction characters in stories and movies, and when we think about them, we think of them as having worth and dignity and so on, although of course they're not members of the species Homo sapien, like E.T., for example, if you want to pick one. So it doesn't seem like it can just be species membership that's doing the job here. And the more I thought about this, the more I realised that if you try and pick a characteristic, you're bound to get either to leave out a lot of humans or to include a lot of non-humans. So, for example, suppose you say that the characteristic that gives humans a special status is some level of rationality, some ability to reason, some ability to follow a talk like I'm giving now, which I take it you all have, but I also take it no non-human has. Even the cleverest chimpanzee with great ability to learn sign language is not able to follow a lecture that talks about abstract concepts like equality. But if you say that's what you need, that's the level you need to get this basic equality, this dignity or worth, of course you're going to leave a lot of human beings out of it, because there are a lot of human beings who don't have the capacity to follow abstract lectures either. No infants have that capacity, and those with severe, irreparable intellectual disability don't have it either. So then you would be leaving them out. Conversely, if you put the level lower and you say, well, really all that's needed is some kind of conscious awareness. It's consciousness, it's what I was talking about in the earlier slides. That really is important for moral status. Then, of course, you bring in a vast number of non-human animals, and you transform the moral universe that way. So it became clear to me that we were going to have to make some difficult decisions if we wanted to have equality based on some actual characteristic like that. And in the end, I came to the view that this was a better way of understanding the principle of equality, both for humans and for non-humans. That is, that equality didn't depend on you having any characteristic except perhaps the most basic level of having interests, which is really the basic level of consciousness or being aware of something. Because you can, in my view, a being has interests if its life can go better or worse for it, subjectively experienced, that is, from the inside, so there has to be some conscious awareness. There's a sense, I think it's really kind of metaphorical sense, in which if you have a plant in a pot and you don't water it, that's contrary to its interests and it's going to die, but I don't think the plant is actually going to suffer. I don't think the plant, for, again, the reasons I gave you earlier, I don't think the plant is conscious, I don't think it has experiences, and I don't think it's going to suffer. So when I talk about interests here, I'm talking about the interests of conscious beings, not interests in this broader sense. And the view of equality that I then want to defend is this idea that if you have interests, your interests ought to get taken into account and ought to get equal consideration with similar interests, note the word similar there, it's important, of other beings, irrespective of their species. So, just as we take the view that the fact that you're not a member of my race is not a reason for me to give less weight to your interests, as racists historically have done, of course, just as we reject that, so the fact that you're not a member of my species is not a reason for me to give less weight to your interests, just because you're not a member of my species. I think that's the crucial principle of equality, which is the foundation of human equality, and also is at the foundation of an equality that is trans-species. But of course, because we're talking about different species, interests will vary. So, this is a slide I actually made for my Princeton, New Jersey students rather than for you, but I'm sure you get the picture. Students in Princeton who were told that they could never visit New York City would probably feel that their interests were harmed in some way. These cows, grazing in a field not too far from Princeton, do not lose anything by being restricted in such a way that they can't go to New York City. They have no interest in visiting New York City. If indeed they can be allowed to live out their lives in a family group of the one you're seeing here on nice green grassy pastures like the one here, or perhaps in winter given shelter and hay and other appropriate feed, that would totally satisfy their interests. So the principle of equal consideration of interest does not, of course, mean the principle of equal treatment. And that's what I said, one of the misunderstandings. You often get people who wish to ridicule a position, who don't want to take it seriously, writing that, that I believe, or that Ingrid Newkirk, or People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, or someone believes that we ought to treat all animals and all humans alike. Neither I nor Ingrid believes anything so silly. We recognise that different beings of different species have different interests, and equal consideration of their interests, taking their interests equally seriously, will not mean that you ought to treat them in the same way. So that's an important principle, and of course, this is a relatively easy application of it, and there are more difficult ones, which I'm going to be talking about. The value of an animal's life, I think, is one of the issues where this does make a difference. And I'm quoting here a philosopher who's generally hostile to the views that I hold, and I'm somewhat hostile to his, not only in regard to animals, but across a wider range of the political spectrum. Roger Scruton is a British philosopher of a generally highly conservative ilk. In the debate that Britain has had over recent years about whether fox hunting should be prohibited, Scruton was an avid defender of the right to chase foxes with dogs, and indeed practiced that pursuit himself, and was proud of it. He lost that, I'm pleased to say, that political battle, and that fox hunting has now been banned. But despite the fact that he's, or perhaps in some ways almost because of the fact that he's conservative, Scruton does not support all forms of farming. And I'll be going into some of the forms of farming that he does not support in a moment. But he argues, you can see this essay is called The Conscientious Carnivore, I'll tell you more about that. He argues that death for an animal is not the same as death for a normal human being. And so here he talks about the distinction that he sees between the notion of, he uses the notion of an untimely death to make this point. He thinks that for a human cut short before one's time, that's a waste or a tragedy, whereas that does not apply to cattle. There's more here, which I think, to be fair, I ought to extend a little. It's not just that. One of the reasons it doesn't apply to cattle, he says, is that, humans have interest in achieving things during their lives. So they have plans, they have hopes. This is glossing, it's not exactly quoting, but it's glossing what he says. They have plans and hopes for the future. they work towards things, they want to achieve things, and one of the tragedies of a premature death is when they're killed before they're able to bring that about. Whereas cattle have no such plans for achievements in their life. And therefore, he says, it's not a tragedy in the same way if they're killed at an earlier age rather than closer to their maturity. Well, I actually think that there is something in this argument. I do think that when we're talking about equal consideration of interests, some interests are broadly similar that we share with non-human animals, and some are rather different. And the interest in not experiencing certain kinds of pain may be broadly similar because our nervous systems may be fairly similar and we may experience some kinds of pains in a fairly basic physical way that we don't like, that we don't require higher cognitive capacities to feel how much we don't like that pain. And on the other hand, there may be interests that do require higher cognitive capacities. And perhaps this interest in continuing to live is like that. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that animals have no interest in continuing to live, but I am saying that when you have a being who has an awareness of their existence over time, is able to plan for the future and so on, then that being has a greater interest in continuing to live, in not having their life interrupted. And I think that does explain some of the differences that we feel between the deaths, the tragic deaths of some human beings and the less tragic deaths of non-human animals. And I have to say that that's something that I share. So, for example, if I think about what happened on September the 11th, 2001, I think that was a tragic day because some 3,000 people, innocent people, had their lives cut short. And if I want to reinforce to myself how tragic that was, I can go back to the pages of the New York Times in the months following September the 11th, when they published short biographies of every one of the victims that they could find and identify and find something about. And they were heartrending stories of people whose lives had been cut short. And they'd interviewed their parents or their fiancés or their husbands or their wives or their children or whatever it was. And very often they mentioned things that they'd been looking forward to, that they'd been hoping to do. They'd been getting married, someone had been delighted to discover that his wife was pregnant, he was going to become a father. Someone had been very excited about getting a job with Cantor Fitzgerald, that great stockbroking firm with its offices high on the World Trade Center tower, and were looking forward to that exciting career. And you do feel a sense of loss, that these people had this strong interest in continuing to live, to see the things that they were looking forward to coming to fruition. And of course we know that on September the 11th, 2001, in addition to 3,000 humans being killed, several million chickens were killed, because several million chickens are killed in the United States every day. And that was just one day, and it didn't stop because of September the 11th. But I have to say, despite what I'm saying to you about equal consideration for animals, that I don't feel that for that reason the deaths of these 3,000 people in the World Trade Center and the Pentagon just pales into insignificance, because what's the difference between several million plus 3,000 and several million? I mean, probably there's more than that much fluctuation in the number of chickens killed every day anyway. But I don't feel that. I don't want to feel that. And I do feel uncomfortable when people for the ethical treatment of animals goes around with exhibitions with pictures of the Holocaust and pictures of the slaughterhouses. I can see the point they're making, I can understand why they do it, but I do feel uncomfortable because I think that there is a significant difference in the losses that isn't just reflected in numbers. All the same, note here that Scruton says, for a human being. And that's not quite accurate, is it, from what I've just said before. What this is true about, this interest in continuing to live, is an interest that human beings with some cognitive capacities have. It's not actually a species difference. It doesn't mark a sharp difference between all members of our species and all members of other species, that all members of our species can have these goals and plans and achievements that they're looking forward to, and no members of other species can. And in fact, again, as I was saying before, there's an overlap. That's just a fact. You know, that I think chimpanzees can look forward to some extent. There's some evidence of that. It's not very strong evidence. They don't look forward, you know, to future careers years ahead, certainly, but maybe they can look forward to some things. And some human beings, infants are an obvious example, don't look forward really at all, aren't aware of themselves enough, newborn infants anyway, to look forward to anything, certainly nothing beyond the next feed. Anyway, so this is not a species difference. This is not something that marks off all humans from all animals, but it is a difference that is significant, I think, when we consider the wrongness of killing animals rather than the wrongness of inflicting suffering on them. So I'll come back to the practical significance of that. Okay, this is where we're at the moment, kind of a recap summary. It's possible for us to conclude, I'm going to suggest, without claiming to have established it, that pain is equally bad no matter what the species of being that experiences it. We're talking about, you know, comparable, similar amounts of pain. But death may be a greater or a lesser loss depending on some of these cognitive factors that I've been talking about. Now I want to ask, if that's so, well, what practical conclusions could we get from what we're talking about? So let me turn to looking at some of the practical implications of what I've been saying so far. Okay, I'm going to focus on animals used in food production, and this is why. Because it's by far the biggest area of animal abuse in the world, and certainly in this country. For many of the years in which the animal rights movement was getting itself established and becoming vocal and active in this country, it focused on animal experimentation. That was what most people thought was the principal area of animal abuse, because that was what the animal movement focused on. I can understand why that was done. I think it served a useful purpose, perhaps, for attracting attention from people who were meat eaters and perhaps would have been too challenged to be directly confronted with that. But I think in a way it was a mistake, because if you look at these figures, the abuse is just so much greater in terms of food animals. These are figures for the US alone. We have 10 billion animals dying in food production each year. 1.5 times the population of the world, as compared with the number of animals used in experimentation in this country each year being something like the population of California. Well, that's a pretty big difference. And if you want to talk about anything else, the use of animals for fur and so on, it's considerably less still. So that's why I'm going to focus on that. It's not the only reason. Another reason is it's something that we have the most control over in terms, at least, of our own consumption. So it's something that we have it in our own hands to do something about immediately, if you agree with the arguments that I'm putting forward. Whereas with some of these other issues, there are certainly things we can do, but they're not so much within our control. Okay, here's a quote from a professor of animal science, Peter Cheek, Oregon State University. Professors of animal science are generally not radical animal activists because they're teaching people animal science and agriculture. They're teaching people who are going to make their livelihood using animals. So they tend to be fairly conservative. And it's rare to find one of them making a statement as strong as this. But what he's saying, I think, is enough to raise an ethical question all of its own. That he's suggesting that the animal food industry relies on secrecy, or relies on minimal publicity for what it does in order to retain its customers. And any industry that cannot be fully transparent, that cannot openly throw back its doors and say, bring in the television cameras and have a look at what we're doing, I think we are right to be to some degree suspicious of. And certainly the animal industry does not do that. For the research on the book that Valerie Tiberius mentioned in introducing me, that I've been doing with Jim Mason, we wrote to hundreds of companies about whether they would allow us to see the way they raise their animals. The only, well, with one exception, the only ones that allowed us to do so were small-scale, sort of free-range, organic producers. The big corporations, none of them did, and we did eventually find one fairly intensive farmer who allowed us in. But the general policy, and it was acknowledged by lots of people we talked to, was that really we don't want the public to see this. However, of course, the public can see it, and I'm going to show you some photos of it. Some are taken from websites that you have easy access to, and I'll refer you to a video at the end if you want more. So, and that's largely due to the, I think, courageous work of volunteers, including, I know, some of the people from the Compassionate Action for Animals here, who have actually themselves gone into trespass, risk prosecution, in order to obtain photos and evidence of what conditions are like. So I'm beginning with a chicken, a standard chicken producing unit. The overwhelming majority of the chicken sold in this country, I don't know if it's 99% or 98%, comes from production facilities just like these. The birds are in huge sheds, maybe 20,000 birds in each of these sheds. They're extremely crowded. They grow very rapidly. They're less crowded, of course, when they're little chicks, when they're put in there. But by the time they get near market weight, which is about 45 days, they are really covering the floor. And it's a situation that is not at all an acceptable one for chickens. They're used to a flock size where they can recognize other birds and keep out of the way of more aggressive ones. They have no hope of doing that here. Also, because they grow so fast, in a significant number of cases, their legs actually can't bear their weight. They've been bred for super rapid growth. And you will find in any of these sheds some birds who simply have collapsed because their legs can't bear their weight. You see these feeding things down the end where the feed and water goes through. Some of them will die of thirst or hunger because they've collapsed too far away from those hoppers and can't reach them. And you can actually find in the poultry journals discussions of this and acknowledgement of the fact that this is because we breed birds to grow so fast. But you also find discussions of the economics of changing it and allowing the birds to grow more slowly so that you don't get these birds that collapse. And the economics work out, even though the producers, of course, lose the value of the birds that collapse because you can't sell birds that have died of starvation or dehydration on the floor. But nevertheless, the economics of it work out that it's better to keep the fast-growing birds and just wipe off the losses of those that die than to have all the birds growing more slowly. And that's why the industry continues this way. I might also point out that another hidden cruelty in this that you can't actually show in a photograph is that think about how these birds are created. These are birds bred to eat an enormous lot and to grow to what looks like almost a full-size chicken in 45 days, in 6 to 7 weeks. Now, they're not mature birds, of course. They're not sexually mature. But they have these enormous appetites. Well, they have to be bred by parents that are genetically like them. So their parents also have enormous appetites. But if you let their parents eat as much as their appetites instinctively drive them to eat, they would grow enormously obese and would probably die before they become sexually mature. They certainly wouldn't last long as breeding birds. But as breeding birds, they've got to continue to breed or you're not going to have more of these chickens. So the breeding birds, the parents, are just permanently hungry. They're kept on a very limited ration. They would, if you allowed them, they would eat at least twice as much as they're getting. Here's another shot of a shed from the sort of bird's eye level. You can see again how crowded together they are. And if you think that switching from chicken to turkey is going to help, it's not. This is, again, the overwhelming majority of America's turkeys are produced in very similar conditions. They're just different birds in the same conditions. The way in which chickens get killed is also pretty much indifferent to their suffering. They're hung on these shackles by the feet. That's after being transported. Of course, the only time they get out of those sheds is to be bundled into cages on a truck, up a conveyor belt and upside down live on these shackles. Then they're supposed to go through an electric stunner. Now, a number of them miss the stunner anyway, because the stunner is like an electrical water bath, and they lift their heads at the particular moment, and they don't actually get stunned. But in the book that I've mentioned, we consulted with experts on stunning, and it seems very likely that the so-called stunner doesn't even stun them, that it just paralyzes them and leaves them conscious. Because if you turn the voltage rate up too high, you risk damaging the flesh. And in order to avoid that, all that's necessary from the point of view of an efficient kill is that they be still when you have the knife cutting their throats. So if they're paralyzed, that's enough. And there is no legal requirement for humane slaughter of poultry in the United States. So this is simply not tested in any way in the courts, and there's really nothing that animal groups can do about it except try to publicise it and make people aware of it, which they haven't achieved a great deal of success on as yet. So it's very probable that, in fact, these birds are suffering twice, when they're paralysed and they actually experience being killed. Another extremely intensive method of confinement is pig production. These are the breeding sows that produce the pigs that are sold. They're kept in these individual crates or metal barred stalls on bare concrete, nothing to nest on. And they're kept like that pretty much their entire lives, because they're pregnant during most of their lives. That's their role in production, and that's how they're kept. It's the cheapest, most convenient way of keeping them. If you gave them straw, for example, there's cost in that, and you would have to clean it out now and again, so there's no economic incentive for producers to give them straw. Here's a different system, not on concrete, but on metal slats. Easy to clean because the dung drops through. You can see again how crowded up they are to get as many of them as possible into a shed. They can't really lie down and stretch their legs out in their own stall. This is what happens when they're ready to give birth. They're confined in a different crate, the farrowing crate, which is supposed to keep them in place so that their piglets can suck on them. That's now their role. Sows are highly intelligent and highly maternal animals, and if you have sows out in a reasonably natural habitat, in a forest with leaf litter, for example, a day or two before they give birth, they will start to build a nest. They have an instinct that they're going to give birth, as birds do, and they will gather twigs and leaves and sticks, and they will build themselves a comfortable nest to lie down in and give birth, which will shelter and keep their piglets warm. If you give them straw, they'll do the same, and a few producers do, but the vast majority of them find this a cheaper and more convenient method of doing it. So the sow is frustrated in her desire to, it might be one tier, there might be two tiers, there might be three or more tiers, but you're having hens extremely crowded in cages. In fact, I've been told that the producer that supplies this university campus with eggs is one of the relatively few producers who does not even accept the woeful guidelines of United Egg Producers, the main producing association for egg producers in this country, who recently, under a bit of pressure, increased their space allowance from 48 square inches, try and measure out what 48 square inches is, 6 by 8 inches per hen, to something like 67, I think, and it's not there yet, it's being phased in. Still miserable. 67 square inches is still illegal in the European Union. I said before, Europe is a bit ahead of this country. 67 inches is now illegal, and the European Union by 2012 is going to go far beyond that as well. But my information is that the producer who supplies dining services on this campus only allows about 48 inches per bird. So it's a shameful situation, I think. And the birds, even if you had just one bird in these cages have 4 or 5 hens per cage. If you just had one bird in these cages, she would not be able to stretch her wings fully. The cage is too small for one bird to fully stretch her wings. With 4 or 5 birds, of course, she has no hope of doing that. In addition, she's constantly rubbing against the wire. Her feathers get rubbed off, and she can't escape from more aggressive other birds in the cage. So, because of this crowding and aggression, when birds were put in cages like this, they started to peck each other, and the stronger birds killed the weaker birds. Well, that's not good for egg production, obviously. So what the farmers did, instead of increasing the space or doing something to relieve the aggression, they cut off the beak of, or part of the beak of the bird with a hot knife. Here's an example of a hen that's been debeaked or beak seared. You can see the upper beak, the sharp part, has been pretty much completely removed. This is not like cutting your fingernails. The hen's beak is probably its most sensitive organ. It's how it relates to the ground, it's how it detects worms in the ground and insects and grains and things. There's a lot of nerves running up that, and it's simply cut off with a hot knife without any anaesthetic or pain relief. Here's a hen that was released from a cage by, I mentioned some of these courageous people who've gone in to these places and sometimes taken photographs or videos, sometimes taken hens that were in need. You can see how many feathers she's lost by being in the cage during this period. She's never been on grass before, but instinctively hens know what to do when they get there. Obviously, within minutes of being out of the cage, they're stretching their wings. Within hours, they're running off chasing insects in the grass, eating grass. They're dust bathing, something hens like to do if they get a little hollow in the soil and fluff up dust around their feathers. They're doing all these things, although they've been living the last year on wire where they couldn't possibly do anything of the sort. But those desires, those instincts are still in them. And of course, they'll lay their eggs in a sheltered nesting place if they can, not on bare wire. No hen will choose to lay her egg on bare wire if she's got an alternative. And the Europeans are going to require that all laying hens be given a sheltered soft floor nesting box to lay their eggs in. Sadly, we seem to be years away from that in this country. You probably have heard about veal calves, and I dare say that a lot of you have already said you're not going to buy veal because of that, so I won't spend time on that. It's another very close system of confinement, rather like the sows that you saw. Beef cattle have somewhat more room, but they still have very barren environments, at least once they're taken off the range and sent to the feedlot, where they spend maybe the last 180 days or something like that of their life. One interesting thing I noticed when I went to look at these feedlots, I went out to Nebraska to look at them for research for this book, is that there's no shade in these feedlots. And you know, it gets pretty hot in Nebraska in summer. And if you've ever seen cattle in a field where there is shade, a field that has trees in it, for example, on a hot day, even not on a very hot day, but just on a warm, sunny day, the cattle will be under the shade. They'll be gathered close to the shade, especially from the middle of the morning until the middle of the afternoon. They can't do it here. They just don't have that option. I saw, again, it's economics. I saw a study done of offering shade to cattle. The authors of that study noted that when they built shade, when they constructed shade, the cattle spent, as I said, most of the day during the warmer parts of the year in the shade. They then said, nevertheless, we did not find any economic benefits in providing shade. And since shade costs a little bit to provide, not very much, but a little bit, there was no follow-up in terms of cattle producers providing shade. Okay, this is a video that I mentioned. If you want to find out more about this, I do recommend you to have a look at it. You can just Google Meet Your Meat, and that will work, I think, for giving you that, or you can get it off Peter's website. Okay, so here's an argument that I'm putting up for, I've said here for vegetarianism. You'll see there's a little qualification to be made about that, but it's certainly an argument that gets you pretty close to that. I've suggested it's wrong to cause pain without a good enough reason. In fact, that's a pretty weak premise. Could go further. I've said that animals suffer in modern meat production. I haven't developed this next point, but I think we all know it's true that we can nourish ourselves. When I say we, I mean we in a society with a wide range of foods available. We can walk into supermarkets and we can buy a huge range of plant foods, meat substitutes, and a whole lot of different things. And we all know people who are vegetarian or vegan who are perfectly healthy. Maybe if you're vegan, you should be taking a B12 supplement, but that's easy to get, and there's nothing else that you're going to lack, really. So we can nourish ourselves in other ways. That gives us a choice. Now, here I come back to the point that I made when I talked about cockfighting and bullfighting. Our enjoyment of the way meat tastes. Once we take away the argument from nourishment, it's our enjoyment of the way meat tastes that is really the reason why we're continuing to do it. That or simply habit, really. But why is that any better than the cockfighter's enjoyment of cockfighting or the bullfighter's enjoyment of bullfighting? I don't think it is. I don't see that it's a more significant, more worthy kind of form of enjoyment. And as you've just seen, the animals suffer from it in a prolonged way. I'd much rather, if I had to choose between being reincarnated as a pig in the intensive pig farm or as a bull that was going to die in the bull ring, I'd choose the bull any day, because basically I'd be pretty well treated most of my life and then die cruelly and painfully in the last hour or two. But it seems a better deal than the other option. So I think we ought therefore to stop eating the products of modern meat production. That seems to me a pretty conclusive argument here. So that's the first, and I think in a way the most important conclusion, practical conclusion that I think we ought to get out of thinking about ethics in animals. I'm running out of time here and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So I was just going to show the way in which there are environmental reasons for avoiding intensive meat production as well, but this shows the different ratios of how much protein you get per acre from plants and animal production, but I'm going to skip that. That's some of the pollution issues in a big pig farm, same thing. Okay, I just briefly wanted to come back to Scruton and his argument that, as I said, killing animals painlessly is not tragic. So if the animals are properly looked after, when all the duties of care are fulfilled, when the demands of sympathy and piety for the animals, that's why, as I say, he's a conservative and he thinks that it's incompatible with piety to treat animals in the way you've just seen. It's not exactly my perspective, but I don't object to people saying that. When you do that, then you can conscientiously eat meat. Now, so this is the kind, I showed you this already, this is the kind of conditions that he has in mind. If the animals are reared, grass-fed, reared and slaughtered on this farm and spend their lives on it, I guess you would say they would have a decent life. Here's an alternative egg production unit. I have to say there's not many that are as good as this. Just buying cage-free eggs wouldn't guarantee you this sort of birds on pasture. But this is a decent life for hens, I think. This is how hens ought to live. And I have to say, I find it, there are still objections you can make. You can still say, well, what happens to the male chicks? They get killed at birth, more or less. What happens to the hens when they stop laying? True, there are still objections, but it's still not a bad deal. Yes, they don't live a full life, but they do live a good life for some time. And if someone like Scruton wants to say, it seems to me on balance that having a life like this is justifiable, and I think we can defend eating eggs from hens like this. I'm not going to stand here and argue against that at this particular point in our development as a society. I think it's much more urgent to focus on getting agreement that we ought to be getting rid of factory farming. And if some people feel that they still want to eat animal products and they're prepared to go to the trouble of finding out where their animal products come from, and they come from places like this or like this, that seems to me to be something that we can debate later on at greater length. I can see arguments going both ways here, to be honest. I am a vegetarian and a sort of a virtual vegan myself, although I'm not totally strict about that when life gets awkward when you're travelling. But I think that's kind of an ideal, but I do think that the switch from factory farming to what I'm showing you now gets most of the distance to where I want to go to. And that's why it's, in talks that I'm giving, it's the point that I'm emphasising. It's the one thing that we can all do, I think, even if we feel we're really kind of addicted to animal products, we can still then say, okay, well, in order to satisfy that, I recognise that it would be wrong to do it by buying factory farm products. But if I'm prepared to take the steps to buy this kind of animal product, maybe that's okay. Maybe I'm okay in satisfying the need that way. So that's really what I wanted to say. I think I don't want to go on very much longer. to avoid running out of time for discussion and question. But these are the kinds of arguments. The most difficult philosophical question here, incidentally, is the one at the bottom of the screen. Does the creation of more animals who would lead good lives justify killing existing ones? And that turns out to be quite a knotty philosophical problem when you look at it. I've written about it in a book called Practical Ethics and elsewhere. There's a more sophisticated discussion by an Oxford philosopher called Derek Parfit in a book called Reasons and Persons, and anyone wanting to plunge more deeply into that, I'll be happy to say a little bit more about it, but it's a big topic. Okay, that's, I think, enough, and that I think still leaves us some time for questions. So thanks very much for your attention. I look forward to your comments.
All right, thank you for the very thought-provoking presentation. What you guys just heard is a lot to process, so I'm sure many of you have questions. Right now we're going to move into the question and answer session. It's 8:30 now, we're going to end at around 9, although maybe we can go a few minutes later because we started late. We have 2 microphones, one here and there, and we ask that you line up by the microphones if you have a question. If you're in one of the upper tiers, please come down if you'd like to ask a question. And we will be alternating from one microphone to the other. And please limit yourself to 1 question. I'm sure many of you have questions, and we want Peter Singer to be able to answer as many questions from individuals as possible. Please limit yourself to 1 question. And also afterwards, after the question and answer session, there is delicious vegan food outside, and it's catered by the Wedge Co-op in Minneapolis. So please stop by after the question and answer session, get some food, and also be sure to stop by the table for Compassionate Action for Animals to get more information on the topics that Peter Singer has been discussing. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, so I think the first person I saw down in the microphone was over on that side. We'll start on that side.
When I talked to a number of my colleagues about coming to this, I actually was surprised at the reaction, which was a number of people were extremely hostile. And basically what they were reacting against was what they took to be terrorist actions by PETA. That is to say, destroying research facilities and stuff like this. I take the argument from the PETA side to be that this is a matter of moral urgency that requires acts that might in other situations not be acceptable, but it's created a tremendous amount of bad will among people you'd otherwise think of being sympathetic towards this. So I was wondering what you would have to say about that and how you would answer these concerns and objections by people like my colleagues.
Right. I have been concerned about this issue for a long time. In fact, right back into the 1980s. I put out, I think Valerie Tiberius mentioned, I've got a book now called In Defense of Animals, The Second Wave. The first edition of that book came out, I think, in '86. And already in that, when there was just beginning some of this violence activity for animals, I said that this was not the right thing to do. That the animal movement, in my view, as I've just outlined, is a movement that takes the high moral ground. I think we have solid ethical arguments on our side. I think when we engage in violent activities, and I mean here, not things like breaking into the farms that I showed and taking out the hens, but violence that is threatening to other humans or, of course, to animals, we abandon that high moral ground, and we abandon the language of reason and persuasion, and we resort to violence, which anyone, however bad their arguments are, can resort to. So I've always argued against the use of those tactics, and I still do. I think, in response to what you said, I should say that, to my knowledge, PETA does not engage in terrorist activities. They've certainly never been convicted of engaging in terrorist activities. They have sometimes given publicity to certainly to those who have done things which involve damage to property, at least. I don't know that whether they've given publicity to anyone who's actually harmed anyone else. I'd be surprised. But, they use dramatic shock tactics in various ways, but it's it's organisations. It's other organisations like the Animal Liberation Front, perhaps, that you're thinking of, or even more shadowy organisations. And I think it's really a tiny handful of people. In fact, I've seen reports from those who are actually involved in counter-terrorist activities who say that probably they think there's no more than 20, 30 people engaged in this kind of activity in the United States. And when you consider the many millions that are involved in the animal movement, I think it's really unfair that because of what gets media, a lot of the whole animal movement gets labelled terrorists. I think overwhelmingly, the people that I meet are not. We're sort of gentle, compassionate, non-violent people. And I think what you reported, the reaction of your colleagues, is one of the unfortunate consequences of this kind of reaction. As you said, I can kind of understand why people do it. They see this great thing going on, which is kind of like an atrocity for them, and they want to do something urgently, but they still need to cool down. I think it's just not actually helping at all. Let's come over this side.
No question, just a comment. Compliment. I compliment you on speaking so clearly, enunciating well. For an Australian, you sure speak nicely.
Good on you, mate.
Hello. When I took business ethics at this school, your article was one of the first that we read, and it was presented as one side, the extreme side of the spectrum, written by this somewhat eccentric author who would suggest that we give away 80% of our salary to support children on the other side of the world. And having any compassion for animals obviously is going to further that kind of reputation. So my question is, how do you stay relevant, legitimate in proponing your point of view, and maybe involved in actually influencing real-world policy making and those kind of things, despite that interpretation of what you stand for?
Well, I think you can have an influence without influencing policy making directly, right? I don't think that I have any influence in Washington, I have to say. Certainly not under this administration, but not even under the previous administration, really. But I do think that I have some influence on individuals. I mean, Valerie Tiberia said that she was influenced to change her diet because of something that I'd written, and some of her students were, and I have had a lot of people over the years telling me that. So if I influence individuals, and if those individuals influence other individuals, it does get to be a movement, and I think in that way it is relevant to the real world. Now, sometimes I will put up extreme positions. You mentioned one in terms of an article that I wrote about our obligations to help those who are starving or on the edge of starvation in the third world. And of course, in that case, I'm not really expecting, anyone, or maybe more than one or two saints, to actually give away most of their wealth to do that. And I have to admit, I don't give away most of my wealth either, though I do give away a substantial amount. But if people are influenced to think about the issue and to give 10% or even 5%, that's significant. And if a lot of people were to give even 5%, according to Jeffrey Sachs, if every middle-class person in the developed world gave 2% of their income, we could solve global poverty issues. So, in a way, sometimes, you, as a philosopher, you kind of look at, well, what really might be implied by these principles, and you expect people to do, to only go some distance in that direction, but that still might be doing a lot of good. Let's come over here.
I'm curious, I've read so often there has been reaction to your ideas or presentations, and people have demonstrated and yelled. What is it that provokes, you think, the most negative reaction to your arguments? What pieces of it? I'm just curious.
The argument I put up today, do you mean, or in general?
Just in general.
Okay, in general. I think there are a number of different things. As the first questioner said, some people are alarmed about my views about animals. People working, doing research with animals may be alarmed that I'm going to incite people to break into their labs or something like that, which is not really what I'm doing, but they may be alarmed. There are others, I was told there were going to be some outside today, I don't know if there are, who are concerned about my views about euthanasia. And my views about euthanasia, I think there are two different groups that are concerned about it. There are sort of pro-life groups in general, the majority of whom are Christian, fairly conservative Christians, who don't like the fact that I challenge the traditional doctrine of the sanctity of human life. You could see that briefly in today's talk, although it wasn't my subject. But when I said that, I think that there is some truth in the idea that it's more seriously wrong to kill a being with awareness of themselves over time, a being with plans for the future, hopes for achievements, and so on. Obviously, that means that I'm not saying that all human life is of equal value. And that's a kind of a basic foundation for a lot of pro-life views, that we don't discriminate within human life. Whereas I'm wanting to say, once you take into account the fact that there are non-human animals as well as humans, you have to have some different criteria. You can't just stand by, if you're a member of our species, your life is infinitely valuable and always to be protected. If you're not a member of our species, your life can be disposed of as an item of property. So that alarms, as I say, pro-life people. It also concerns some people in the more militant disability movement, because I've suggested that parents should sometimes have the option of ending the lives of their severely disabled infants. In fact, of course, parents do now in this country sometimes have that option, because if their severely disabled infant needs life support, some doctors will offer them the option of withdrawing life support, knowing that the infant will die. And doctors do that quite openly. I take my students at Princeton to a nearby Roman Catholic hospital, where the director of the neonatal intensive care unit will tell my students that he does that in cases of the most severe brain damage, for example. So I don't think it's quite as radical as people think, but because I don't think there's a crucial difference between bringing about the death of a baby by turning off a respirator or bringing about the death of a baby who doesn't need a respirator but is perhaps equally severely brain damaged by giving that baby a lethal injection, that gets people up in arms because they think that I'm saying something that is somehow much more hostile to those with disability than simply supporting withdrawal of treatment. I disagree on that, but I think it is one of the reasons why people get alarmed. Thank you. Let's come over this side.
Hi. I recently have read about some amazing scientific studies that sort of address the issue of animals suffering by a different route, in which the scientists explore with growing meat in petri dishes, for example. And as a proponent of a more connective moral theory, the equal consideration of similar interests connects beings across species lines. I was wondering if you would comment on something like a more disconnected route for addressing the same issue, and whether or not you think that there's a significant difference between a connected route and a disconnected route.
Mm-hmm. Right, okay. I've actually seen a piece of meat grown in a petri dish, in fact in a lab in Australia a year or so ago. It was about this big, and I was told that if you actually costed it out, that it probably cost several $1,000s to produce. So we're still some distance from it being an economic form of production. But of course, we know that, how many years ago is it that a computer that would do fairly simple tasks took up a room and cost a huge amount of money. So it's not impossible that we'll find ways of growing meat from a single cell in a dish, and that it will actually be cost effective and that will have similar quality and palatability to meat that's on sale now. I wouldn't have any problem with eating that kind of meat. You're not causing any additional suffering by doing so. And if that's a way of getting people off the kind of factory farm meat that we've seen now, then I hope that comes soon. But I think there is going to be a fair curve in doing this, and of course there's not a huge amount of money going into producing it at this stage. I guess because it's not close enough to looking like a saleable product. But if that day comes, then good.
Thank you. As humans, we can kind of sit around here in the concert hall and debate that, torturing and killing animals. But non-human carnivores don't really seem to debate about this. Does this make us less equal, or is it just something that's...
Well, it's different, I think. It just makes us different. It means that, we cannot appeal to non-human carnivores to change their ways. And in fact, since basically they are carnivores and we're omnivores, they really couldn't survive anyway, at least not on anything that's available to them now. So I think that it's a different situation. I think that we have an obligation to think about the ethics of what we're doing and to act ethically once we've reflected on that. They're not capable of doing that, so they don't have that obligation. I don't think that we have an obligation to force them to, especially given that that will change the ecological balance and would probably mean that they would die out and so on. So, yes, of course we're different to them because of our different capacities, as I mentioned in the talk. We are different to them and we have different opportunities to them. And I think we ought to take those opportunities and not look to them as any kind of example, because they're clearly not an example in that sense for us to follow.
I feel I should kind of preface what I'm about to say with I've been a vegan for about 3 years, and I'm not dead yet. That's important. And I think the final slide that you showed of the argument for vegetarianism that's pretty much the argument that I usually use. My question relates more to I came upon being vegan the same way you did, over lunch with a friend. And the question was posed, why can you treat one species this way and why another a different way? And the answer that you came to was the equal consideration issue. And I was wondering on that, I guess I would contest that by asking what is your definition of reason? And that's because that is what I think separates humankind from animal kind, from animals other than humans. I guess, yeah, what is your definition of reason that allows you to consider that as not a substantial difference from non-human animals?
Okay, now I'm not quite sure that I understand the question is what's my definition of reason, but I'm not really sure how that fits into what you said before. Are you talking about when I said that some humans, not all of them, have rational capacities that animals don't? Is that what you're referring to?
Essentially, you made the statement that if we say all humans are equal, we need to include animals because they're if we don't, we're just kind of doing the same it's the same thing as racism, it's the same thing as sexism, and I would say that isn't the case, and that it is reason that separates us from animals, and you brought that point up and said that reason in fact doesn't separate us from animals, and I was wondering what definition of reason you had that allows you to make that assertion.
But I would have thought on sort of more or less any definition of reasoning, capable of following logical processes and so on, it doesn't separate us because nobody thinks that a month-old infant is capable of reasoning of any sort, do they? I mean, you don't think that. So there are clearly some humans who don't reason.
I would say that the crucial difference there is that a human baby has the capacity to develop reason. As a mentally disabled person had that capacity at one point and still may to some level. And it's that capacity for inductive reasoning, as in seeing the implications of something and pulling a principle out of a set of deductions or inductions.
See, I don't think it's the definition of reason that we're differing about. I think we have the same definition of reason. But you think that the fact that you, in some sense, have this capacity or had it makes you different and gives you some kind of moral status that a being that doesn't ever have it doesn't have. But I mean, I'd even dispute that that's true of all humans, because there are some humans who, just from their conception, already have a genetic defect such that they will never develop these powers of reasoning. Right? So if you have that genetic defect from conception, then even though you're biologically human, you couldn't really even say you have this capacity or had this capacity. So I mean, I think that's still going to be a hard case for you to handle if you want to really separate all humans from animals because of the capacity to reason. I think we're going to have to move on, I'm sorry, because there are lines of both mics. Yeah, thanks.
Good evening. I agree confined area feedlots and battery cages are abhorrent, but for people who do choose to continue eating meat products, does the emergence of an avian influenza and the threat of a global pandemic alter your view of those types of so-called animal biocontainment facilities?
No, it doesn't. And I've noticed that some people have been saying, in fact, I think there was an interview in a paper here I just picked up in the hotel that suggested that avian influenza is less likely to spread because of, if most of your hens are in, or chickens are inside. That's not really true, and you can find other people saying, and I've quoted them in this book that's now gone to press, that indeed it's precisely because we have so many birds inside that when you get the virus into one of these sheds, it spreads very rapidly throughout the entire shed. And it also has a higher chance of mutating because it's spreading through so many birds. And of course, we know that the real danger with this virus, to humans that is that it mutates, because it's not really contagious to humans at the moment. There's no clear cases of human-to-human transmission, only of bird-to-human transmission. So if we don't want it to mutate, we would eliminate all forms of avian factory farming straight away. Also, it's a mistake to think of these places as bio-contained, because they're not. Anyone who's been in an intensive egg place, for example, will tell you that there are vermin there. There are quite often mice and rats in there, which are going in and out. There may also be sparrows going in and out. They're not at all really effectively contained. So I don't think that that's a safeguard at all. In Europe there's been a bit of debate about this, and some people are arguing that in fact it's the outdoor birds that have the stronger immune system. They've developed more immunity from being outside and are more likely to resist avian influenza. So, when I read that our government is spending $7 billion or whatever to stockpile Tamiflu or something to protect us against avian influenza, I kind of think, well, that's a cost, that's a tax that we vegans are paying to the rest of you guys, because we didn't want all these birds to be here that were going to spread this influenza, and now our government is having to take measures to protect us all because of this system of so many billions of birds being here in the first place.
This question might kind of step out of the realm of practicality, and it might have already been addressed by someone else to a certain extent, but given some of the arguments that you've made, do you think that there could ever exist an obligation for us as humans to protect animals from the needless suffering caused by other animals?
Yeah, it's a bit like the carnivore question, isn't it? I suppose you can imagine that happening. It's kind of really saying, should we play policeman to the rest of creation and the rest of the world? And I'm reluctant to say we should, because historically we've always done it very badly. And we're likely to mess it up again and cause huge ecological problems. But I suppose, in theory, if we said, well, imagine we could really do it well and we'd reduce the amount of animal suffering, then it comes down to a clash of values between, yes, I want to reduce unnecessary animal suffering, no, I don't want to upset the ecological balance or cause certain species to go extinct. So I don't know whether we could actually have both. If we could somehow have both, I'd be prepared to do it. Otherwise, I'd probably say no.
Thank you for being here with us tonight. In recent years, in response to bad publicity, fast food chains, certain fast food chains have made a lot of publicity out of improving their practices. Like McDonald's has made sure everyone knows that they've made slight changes in the way that they slaughter their animals, and Chipotle advertises aggressively the humane treatment, the humane ways they raise their animals. I wonder would you consider that, those incremental steps, a form of progress, or is it more of a fig leaf that's going to make the greater goal sort of further off?
No, I guess I do consider them progress. I think you mentioned two different examples, and they're interesting examples. In the case of McDonald's, we have the world's largest retailer of animal products, etc., essentially, making a very, very small step. And you know, that comes close to being a fig leaf, but I think it probably does make a bit of a difference to the birds. I mean, what they've done, for those who don't know, they've done two basic things, really. One is, I already mentioned that the egg producer here does not even meet these UEP guidelines. Well, McDonald's have insisted that all their egg producers do actually meet a standard that's slightly higher than the UEP guidelines. And in fact, McDonald's, you have to say to their credit, got in before the UEP, that's the United Egg Producers, changed their guidelines. So McDonald's was, after pressure from the animal movement, a bit of a pioneer in just moving these things up a little bit. And that affects a large number of birds, a very large number of birds, and they just have a little bit more room. As I said, still a level of room space that's illegal in Europe, but you know, more than they have been having in the United States. So I think that that's something. I don't think it's really going to be effective in stopping people from, you know, thinking about this and wanting further changes. If I did, then I'd worry. But I think it's something that has happened. Chipotle is a bit at the other side of things. I showed you the pigs in the stalls and indoor pigs and so on. Well, Chipotle has actually gone out of its way to source its pig products from an outfit called Nyman Ranch, which has pretty good standards. I didn't show you sort of outdoor pigs, but the pigs do have to be either outdoors or in deeply straw-bedded pens. They have to have plenty of room to move around. You know, the sows are able to build those nests, like I said. And definitely, you know, those Nyman Ranch pigs have a significantly better life. Now, I'm not sure at this stage, because we looked at this when we were doing the book, but things changed. I'm not sure that Chipotle uses only Nyman Ranch or similar standard pork products. At the time we talked to them, they were doing it in some markets but not others. So you probably need to go and, you know, ask the local ones, where are your supplies coming from? They were trying to get you know, better sources for other animal products as well. But it was a matter, to some extent, of building up supply. But that's good, you know, if they're creating demand, building up supply, that's a good thing. So, yeah, I think that that's worthwhile. And of course, the other thing about Chipotle is you can go into Chipotle and have a vegan meal as well. So, you know, that's good that they provide that and they provide that extra option. So I'm prepared to give them a reasonable amount of kudos for what they're doing in this area.
But of course, it makes people in there feel better about eating the animals. So
yeah.
Does it set the whole movement back?
Well, no, because I think we're so far back that it's actually it is moving forward. I hope that we'll get past that eventually. But at the moment, we're still well behind that.
Thank you.
I would like to ask about another question of progress, the Grade A project, and I believe in Spain currently there's an MP who's proposed signing the declaration of the Great Apes. Do you feel that this is something that could be accomplished in the near future, and do you think it's a true milestone from going from simply animal welfare to animal rights?
Okay, so for those who don't know about it, the Great Ape Project is something that I co-founded in about 1993, I think, with an Italian animal activist called Paolo Cavalieri. And the idea was that, you know, at that stage we seemed somewhat stuck with the vast majority of animals. Europe was not yet making the progress that I talked about. And we sort of thought, well, you know, is there a different kind of tactic that could advance things a little bit? And we said, well, why not look at those animals that are closest to us, a rather small group of animals, the great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, bonobos. And why not point out how much we know about them, how close they are to us in various ways, draw on the work of Jane Goodall and many other excellent scientists who've studied them and have shown that they are, you know, they have rich, complex emotional lives, they're thinking beings, they do have some self-awareness and so on. And since they're not the subject of a vast industry, why not try and get some real basic rights for them? You know, recognise their rights to life and liberty and protection from torture, and try and, you know, move them out of a property status and get them to be something different. So we edited a collection of essays called the Great Ape Project, which various people that puts forward this view. Now, we didn't make very much progress for some time, although we made a bit actually. I think partly of the things we were triggering, the British government said it would not allow any more research on great apes, and in fact now, in the whole of the European Union, research on great apes has pretty much been phased out. There may be a handful left still, but when they die, there won't be any. Even in the United States, it's no longer acceptable to kill chimpanzees when you finish researching on them. When we started, it was. Chimpanzees were just like other animals. You'd done your research. They were no use for further experiments. You just killed them. That was the cheapest thing to do. Now they're supposed to go to a sanctuary. There isn't enough money to provide good sanctuaries, but you're not supposed to kill them. Yes, that's a kind of progress. In Spain, as you just mentioned, and this is quite a recent development, a Spanish MP, there is a Spanish branch of the Great Ape Project, by the way. A Spanish MP has been taking up this cause, and the Spanish government, as you might know, is a fairly progressive government, and is getting some sympathy from other people in the Spanish Parliament about some kind of legislation that would in some way incorporate these rights. And what that would mean would be, I think, that great apes in Spain had special protection that, as I say, they're already not being used for research, but some of them, for example, are owned by photographers, and you can go to places on the Spanish tourist resorts on the beaches, and you can have yourself photographed with a chimp or something like that. But the chimps have pretty miserable lives when they're not being photographed. So it would stop some of these abuses. But of course, the main thing it would do would be a symbolic statement that there are non-human animals who really are entitled to some basic rights. And for that reason, it could be important. I'm not going to, exaggerate its importance. I think it's in a way, it's a small-scale thing compared to what I've been talking about today. But symbolically, I think it could be valuable. Yes. So, any of you have Spanish connections, whatever, know people in Spain, get them to write to their member of Parliament and tell them about this. It could be a useful thing to do. Yes.
Would you accept that in some cases the human interests achieved by animal medical research sometimes outweigh the animal interests? And do you believe this is the current state in the US?
Okay, I certainly believe that it's possible for human, or for that matter, animal interest in research to outweigh interests of non-human subjects of research. That's, if you judge things as I do in terms of the consequences and in terms of this principle of equal consideration of interest, that's pretty hard to deny, because there are going to be some kinds of research that you can more effectively do with animals than you could do with humans, and you can't do them with computer models or tissue cultures or whatever, because you need a whole organism for some of what you're doing. So that's probably going to be true. Do I think that that's generally the practice in the United States today? Absolutely not. I think that we are still in a model where animals are just research tools. You can order them up for your needs. Yes, you do have to go before some committee, but the committees vary a lot as to how seriously they look at the research, and they certainly are not sort of told to weigh the interests of animals equally with similar interests of humans or anything like that. So I think most research in this country fails that test. But if you really went through all that and screened all that out, you may be left with a small number of animal experiments which you had modified in order to reduce to the maximum extent possible the amount of suffering that animals experience, and done only where there was a clear and large benefit. I'd have to concede that some of that might continue.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm being given wind-up signals fairly soon, so let's see if we can get through the questions standing at the mics now, but we're going to wrap it up with the last people at the mics now. Okay. So, now what side? I think you're next, right? Yep.
Yes. I would like to go back to the beginning of your presentation and to this principle of equal consideration of similar interests for all beings conscious, all conscious creatures. What's the problem? What's the harm in cutting off just considering the interests of human beings? You mentioned that you consider the consequences of a principle as that's the important thing, right? Mm-hmm. What are the harmful consequences of cutting off the interests of non-human conscious beings and only considering the interests of humans?
Well, they're harms to the non-human beings, right? I think I showed you some of them on the screen. I'm not saying they're harms to humans, but they are harms to the non-human animals.
Why should we consider them?
Well, that was my argument, really. Okay, I'm not sure what it is that you're disagreeing with. I said that the fact that you're a member of our species is not a reason, it's not a good reason for thinking that you're interested in more. I mean, I'm not sure whether you're just, I mean, let me take you back to an egoist position. Suppose that I said, why shouldn't I consider only my own harms? Right? Is that the same kind of argument you're putting to me now?
Yeah, it seems that you have a presumption in favor of, everyone's interest should be considered equally. I don't think that that presumption is justified.
Okay. So the argument that I put forward, I think, is an argument that assumes that you're not an egoist, but you think that the interests of all humans ought to count. And I'm arguing against where you're drawing the line now, and I've made that argument, so I won't go over it. If, however, you said, look, show me a reason why I should think anyone else's interests other than mine count at all, I haven't given you an argument tonight about that. That would be a different lecture, and it's an interesting and difficult philosophical problem. But otherwise, I could only repeat what I've said as to why I think just saying human interests matter, but the interests of non-humans don't, isn't the right place to draw the line. Okay, move on.
Coming from what can be characterized, I guess, as a developing nation, do you ever feel like your argument, however compelling, is more relevant to the industrial world and much less so for, I guess, the remaining 80–90% of us who are concerned about nutrition, survival, shelter, and nourishing our offspring on a day-to-day basis?
Well, it's certainly true that if you're struggling to get enough food to feed your family, you're probably going to use whatever you can. And to that extent, yes, you're right. My argument doesn't apply to, unfortunately, I don't think it's 80 or 90%, but there's a substantial percentage of the world. Let's say it's the 2.6 billion that are living in poverty, below $2 per day purchasing power equivalent. Probably for that proportion, a third of the world's population at least, this is not really very relevant. But once you get above that level, I think people can make choices. And I'm pleased to say that animal liberation has been translated into Chinese, for example, and is available in the mainland Republic of China. It hasn't had huge sales, but there are people there who are interested in the issue, and China is starting to think about issues about animal welfare. And you could say, well, that's because it's at least parts of China have started to rise a little bit above the bottom. I agree with that. I think being able to think ethically about our food supply is kind of a luxury that we have when we get to a certain level of food security.
When you were tracing back the Western tradition, you mentioned Pythagoras, but I noticed significantly that you stopped at that time. But 2600 century BC was in the Indian subcontinent at the time of the Buddhism. So within the Indian Buddhist and Hindu and Jain tradition, what you were saying is actually the main orthodoxy. The non-human beings, there is a duty of compassion that you cannot kill, because compassion extends to everyone because it is the duty of rebirth. The ones who are human beings today were animals before, and the ones who are animals today will become human beings in future. The fact that you confine yourself entirely to the Western tradition, is it because of professional convenience or because you think that the very distant paradigms do not contribute anything to your cause?
No, it's certainly not the latter. It's partly that I'm not expert on Eastern tradition, certainly. It's partly that I'm addressing a Western audience. This is overwhelmingly, obviously not entirely, but an overwhelmingly Western audience. So this is where our traditions come from. And I also have to say that, regrettably, these traditions have become extremely influential in other parts of the world as well. So I'm sure you're aware that meat consumption is rising now in India. People who traditionally did not eat meat are eating increasingly meat, and that's the influence of the Western tradition, the Western example, the films, the advertising that they see. And this is happening in China too, where although they didn't have quite the tradition that you were talking about, they traditionally did not eat very much meat. So I think that it's important to confront this tradition because of its huge influence all over the world. I certainly recognize and respect the Eastern traditions that you mentioned. I wish that they were more influential even in their own countries, and particularly the Buddhist tradition, because unfortunately most nations that are influenced by Buddhism are not predominantly vegetarian. I mean, say Thailand, which considers itself a Buddhist nation, is not a predominantly vegetarian nation. So I regret that in a way, as often happens with you know, reforming radical movements, they perhaps sometimes lose their steam a little bit and need to be revived again from time to time. So you can say that's what I'm going to do. Thank you. Let's go over to the side.
Could you contrast how the vegan discourse is sort of perceived compared here to, say, in Europe? For example, here it seems to me that, at least locally, the vegan discourse is sort of marginalized in a way that where vegans are very radical and, you know, this sort of thing. Do you see it as, first of all, that in Europe the vegan discourse is perhaps more moderate, and secondly, how is the discourse pushed into that moderate conversation?
Yeah, look, no, I have to say, I think that vegans in Europe too, even though they might be a somewhat larger proportion, are still a small minority and are still seen as the, if you like, the sort of radical edge of the animal movement. I don't think that that's very different. They might feel a little bit less isolated. You might have, you know, easier selection of vegan food choices. They might be more clearly marked on menus and so on. But I think what's really different about the United States and Europe is the much greater awareness of factory farming and the much greater desire to avoid it. I mean, we have major supermarket chains in Britain, Marks and Spencer's and now Sainsbury's, for example, that will only stock cage-free eggs. And in fact, most of those cage-free eggs are genuinely free-range eggs, not just barn eggs. Now here, you know, here we have Whole Foods and Wild Oats, I think, are the only supermarket chains that don't stock caged eggs. And they're, you know, they're pretty reasonably expensive sort of elite kind of chains. I mean, it's great that they've done it, but, you know, you have to think it's as if in this country you had Safeway or somewhere like that saying, you know, we've had such reaction from our customers that we're not going to stock caged eggs at all anymore. And we're still a long way from that. So I think that's the bigger difference than the difference about the status and position of the vegan discussion.
You seem to address the question of animal rights from a fairly consequential or utilitarian perspective, and I'm wondering, you just take for granted the assumption that that things like bullfighting or cockfighting are inherently wrong and that the balance of the equation is unfavored towards that. But I'm curious if you offer any mechanism for weighing the comparative suffering across species or even within a species when you're considering the mentally disabled as having lower suffering rate from human beings. And if you offer any mechanism for weighing the comparative benefit or wrong from, say, testing on animals or from eating animals.
Okay, let me just correct one thing that I think could be a bit misleading. I don't think that intellectually disabled people necessarily have less suffering than others. I do think that there's some kinds of suffering that they're not capable of, perhaps if they're severely intellectually disabled, like the loss of their future plans or whatever. But they may be just as acutely aware of certain kinds of suffering, just as animals may be.
In the context of your remarks, of course.
Yeah. Okay, so, but, you know, do I have a way of weighing up perhaps you're suggesting, you know, well, there's a lot of spectators at a bullfight, how do we know that they don't get more pleasure than the bull suffers or something like that? But I think, you know, when people think like that, we should be thinking about a slightly different sort of calculation. It's great that people get pleasure from watching spectator sports, but there are great spectator sports where nobody really gets harmed, or nobody gets harmed unless they've voluntarily consented. So, you know, Spaniards, in fact, enjoy football a lot as well. And I'm not sure that there'd be less enjoyment in the long run if you got rid of bullfighting and you replaced it with other sports. So it's that kind of calculation that you have to make. And you have to think of the long-term consequences of, you know, yes, the transition might be hard on the bullfight aficionados for a little while they get used to something else, but in the long run, they'll get used to it. And the bulls will never get used to the suffering that they experience in the ring. Okay, better keep moving on so we can wind up. Yeah.
Several times you made a distinction between the sometimes extreme theoretical consequences of your arguments and more practical action. And while we certainly can't expect everyone in the world to become saints, what justification do I have on the individual level to not follow through to the extreme consequences of my beliefs, even if they are extreme.
Okay. If you're asking what kind of moral justification do I have for not following through, I think the answer probably is none. You don't. Insofar as you're thinking as a purely moral being, you really ought to follow through all the way. And I recognize that and I feel that pull. But I guess I also perhaps just sort of, accept that I'm not a saint. I'm not doing what's 100% the right thing on every occasion. Should I therefore be castigating myself with it and walking around with a great dark cloud over my head all the time because I'm not as good as I think I should be? Well, maybe, but then I can also recognize that I'm going some way further than a lot of other people are. So I can feel some satisfaction, if you like, that, yeah, I'm not doing everything, but, I'm getting there. And it's, it's hard living in a society where most people are not doing very much at all, if anything, of what they should be doing. So I guess I have this ambivalence between thinking, well, I'm doing a lot better than most people, but I'm not doing nearly as good as I should. But I don't claim that that's a moral justification. That's sort of, if you like, why I'm not as hard on myself as I might be if I were the kind of moralist who really just thought that anything less than 100% following the right path all the way is something that I really ought to be constantly upset with myself about. Okay, we're going to make yours the last.
Thank you. Some 6 to 10 million companion animals, cats and dogs, are euthanized every year in the United States, and upwards of 90,000 horses are going to slaughter in North America, as you probably know all of this, each year. What pragmatic solutions would you suggest for those of us who are working in humane groups and are trying to encourage people to stop overpopulation and overbreeding of animals that then end up unwanted and suffering?
That's a good question, and I don't, unfortunately, have a kind of, easy solution to this problem. I think it is actually one of the issues that we've made progress on. You may know the figures. You've obviously got the current figures in your head very well, better than I do. But I've seen figures suggesting that although this number is appalling, when you think of these millions of animals being unnecessarily killed, it's actually a lot lower than it was 10 years ago, isn't it? You're aware of that? I'm fairly sure. Well, I know you're shaking your head, but there was a book, The State of the Animals, put out by the Humane Society of the United States, that I had a year after it, The State of the Animals 2003 or something. I looked at that, and it looked like there was a reasonably steady improvement in the reduction of the number of companion animals being killed, being euthanized. So I thought that something is happening that's good. People are being educated a bit. It's still a slow task, but I think that's all we can do. We can educate people. Of course, if we have sympathetic state legislators, we can get legislation to put financial incentives on people to sterilise their animals. I think that's necessary in this case to do. So there are these tactics which I'm sure you know about, and I think we just have to keep going and work harder on that issue as on many others. Thanks very much for your questions and attention.